we invite Prof. Jonathan Jansen to speak. You know, we've been privileged at Symphonia for South Africa and particularly School Leadership Forum to, over the years, have had Prof. Jonathan Jansen on this platform. This year, again, we are privileged to have him speak. And for many of us, we know him from the days of, firstly, when he was most recently the Vice Chancellor at Free State, and now as he is working with Stellenbosch University. But also many of us have been reading his articles on Times Live and appreciated those insights. Some of you even read his books, I know, and have found them stimulating for thought, critical thinking. It's also allowed for debate. And for some of us, we've used that as a guide to our thinking around how do we live out our lives as leaders in the school space. So Prof. Jansen, thank you so much again for availing your time. And we know you're busy, but always a privilege to have you on this platform. Just to say the format, Prof. Jansen will have a conversation with us about this, about the topic of citizen leadership in the education sphere and why is it important for educators to see themselves as citizen leaders. Once he's done, we will engage the larger community, and we really ask you, if there are questions that arise, there's a team in the background. They will be trying to filter out the questions. So help us in that respect, just to type in questions even as the conversation goes along. Prof. Jansen, over to you and welcome.
Thank you very much, Selwyn, and what an incredible honor to be with these distinguished educationists, distinguished leaders, 74 of them I see, on this chat today. I really look forward to this in a day that started at 5 o'clock this morning and will end at midnight tonight. So it's busy, and you always look for the one thing in the day that really just gets you excited and all of that. And for me, it is this platform to talk with my colleagues. So wonderful. So I see two of my favorite principals in the world on the screen. I'm going to ask them to unmute themselves and to show their faces, because I have a question for them. So Anne Morton, will you come online? And Belinda Peterson, would you also come online? Let me see you.
Hi, Jonathan.
Hey, happy birthday.
Thank you.
You thought I'd forget. And
yeah,
who is Volodymyr Alexandrovich?
Good heavens. I haven't the faintest idea. Maybe he's Putin's brother.
Listen, you are our most distinguished principal. I talk behind your back. And I know you keep your kids on top of things with current affairs. So that is a surprise. Belinda, who is Volodymyr Alexandrovich?
It's too late in the day to be asking such complicated questions.
Oh man, I tell you, my two most favorite principles. Anyway, okay, so Volodymyr Alexandrovich Zelensky is the president of Ukraine. Zelensky.
I was close.
All right.
I didn't hear that part.
Yeah, no, exactly. Zelensky would have given it away. Okay, let me try again. I'm going to start with Belinda this time. Belinda, before he became a politician, what was his profession?
Wasn't he a comedian?
That is correct. So Zelensky was a comedian, and most people in in Ukraine would know that. In fact, he played in a television. He played the role of a fictional president until he became a real president. And very interestingly, one of the programs that he was on was called the Club of the Funny and Inventive People. That's the awkward English translation, obviously, from Russian. Be that as it may, until a few weeks ago, nobody knew about Volodymyr Alexandrovich Zelensky. He was a minor politician, albeit of a really large country with 44 million people in Eastern Europe. And the only way I knew about him is because he kept featuring in the run-up to the American presidential elections when President Trump, the then President Trump, made a call to Zelensky and pressured him to find dirt on his electoral opponent, which was the current president, Joseph Biden. And in order to, the way Trump, as only Trump can do, would pressure the man, was to withhold 400 million in military aid in exchange for the dirt. So clearly what Trump was doing is to look for the equivalent of an email stash, as in when he attacked Hillary Clinton, in order to obviously undermine his opponent. That's the way Trump plays politics, dirty politics, and so on and so forth. And that's how I knew about Zelensky, but he didn't strike me as a particularly, eloquent or forceful or any kind of person until Russia invaded Ukraine. So here is something that I first heard, I'm sure others have said it, but I first heard Michelle Obama say this several times, that when you have a crisis, it doesn't make leaders. A crisis doesn't make a leader. A crisis reveals a leader, and so on. And I think that's certainly true of what is happening right now, tragically, in Eastern Europe and so on. Everybody muted? Okay. And what does this crisis reveal about Zelensky? It reveals a man of incredible courage and commitment, but at the same time, it reveals the Russian president, Vladimir Putin, as a ruthless, mendacious autocrat who might, in my view, still discover the futility of imperial overreach in the 21st century. In other words, his mind is still in 19th century Russia, where you can just walk into another country and take it over the way the Europeans did with Africa and other parts of the world at the end of the 20th century. And so, as they say in my second language, I shall say Khatsin, and I think that's quite a possibility given overreach in Eastern Europe. Now, what makes the Ukrainian president such an admired leader worldwide is that he contrasts so powerfully in our times with feckless leaders. And the word feckless is a very interesting English word. It means without strength of character, without strength of character. And on the world stage, there are so many of our leaders who are feckless, including, dare I say, our own President Ramaphosa, whom the Sunday Times reported last week was upset with DIRCO, this is the International Relations Department, for urging the withdrawal of Russia from Ukraine. Can you believe that? What is it about the leadership of Zelensky that could teach South African political leaders a lesson or two? And then I will also bring that down, obviously, to education. What can we as leaders learn from Zelensky? And the first thing I want to mention to you is that he stands with his people in a crisis. And God knows I've had a few of those in my lifetime in education, and I know many of you have had that experience as well. That when there is a crisis, your natural instinct is to want to hide. Your natural instinct is to disappear. Your natural instinct is just to wait for this terrible thing to blow over. But what he does as a leader is to stand with his people. As the Russians marched towards Kiev, the capital, the Americans offered the Ukrainian leader an airlift out of his troubles. And his response is one for the history books. This is what he said: "I am here. I need ammunition, not a ride." And he used his social media account to optimal effect, with Zelensky regularly posting pictures of himself in army fatigue, surrounded by fighting soldiers, and encouraging the people to stand strong in the face of Russian aggression. Let me ask you this as South Africans, or wherever you're from in the world. Where was our leader or our leaders in the July 2021 riots in KZN and Gauteng? Did you see any of them in the middle of the crisis on the ground? Were they communicating with us on an hourly basis? Were they working to strengthen our resolve against anarchy? No, as some of you just posted, they were nowhere to be seen. And so I want to talk, first of all, and I might have talked to some of you about this in another forum, about what does it mean to be present as a leader. And on various occasions, I've talked about, first of all, I would only mention this in South Africa, about the need for physical presence. Now, this should be assumed, right? That if you get paid, you show up for your job every single day because you get paid, because you have an obligation, even if you don't care about the kids, even if you don't, worry about the fact that by staying away from school, you put that pressure on the teachers who do come to school. And yet in South Africa, the research is very clear that in many of our schools, the attendance of teachers is sporadic. And that has obvious effects on learning outcomes, among many other things. On Monday, I called the principal of Heathfield High School about a personal matter. And he says, "Man, I'm sorry I couldn't take your call the first time. I'm here, basically teaching several classes of kids because, wait for this, 14 teachers are absent. How the hell do you run a school with 14 teachers absent on a Monday morning? You can't. It's impossible. And yet we cannot assume the simple thing in many of our schools, that your physical presence isn't guaranteed. I'm not obviously talking about this and COVID and long, that is obviously stuff that any empathetic leader will understand. But 14 teachers absent on a Monday morning, you can't run a school. You can't run a company. You can't run anything with that kind of absence. And so even just to be physically present is such an important thing. Now, I suspect that the leaders, whether you're a leader in your classroom or a leader in your school or a leader in business, I suspect that the people who are on this line today are people who do show up physically. So I'm preaching to the choir, I suppose. But let me just remind you that all is not well in many of our schools when it comes to physical presence. Zelensky is physically present amongst his people. He shows you that with his Instagram account. He shows you that as he walks around the beautiful cathedrals and so on of Kiev. And that is leadership, to be present amongst your people in a crisis. But physical presence is only one of the things I've spoken about before. Another is spiritual presence. It's that quality of not being visible and yet being impactful. The teacher who leaves the classroom and there is no sign that she left because she is still there, even though the principal called her to the office. That kind of spiritual leadership you often hear when somebody says, when he comes into or she comes into a room, everybody pays attention. You can feel, this was certainly true of charismatic leaders like Nelson Mandela and many others. When the person comes into the room, you feel their presence. This has very deep resonances in the Bible, for example, and I've often used that from both Psalm 23 and Matthew 18, the power of presence, even though the person you worship isn't there physically. That spiritual leadership is something that can be developed by school principals, by business leaders, by community leaders. It is something that is not, but it's difficult. The fact that when you're even not there, the productivity of the company continues to grow. Even when you're not in your school, everybody knows what the rules and routines and the repertoires of leadership are about. They feel your presence even when you're not there. There is emotional presence. The fact that you have all your senses on high alert when you walk into your school environment, and you can sense that that teacher in the corner of the staff room is having a hard time. You can sense somebody probably went through some grief. You can sense that a child is just unhappy. I'm sorry to embarrass her again, but I've literally seen that in the leadership, going more than once to Anne's school, to the Red School. There's very few people that have such a sense of emotional connection to the children, even as they run past her and their visitors in the passage. And so emotional leadership is leadership that is connected to the staff, is connected to the students. You know where, and by the way, the best way to develop the skill of emotional leadership is to walk around, is to go to classrooms, is to be visible on the playground, is to simply be alert to the needs of others and to sense when something. By the way, until COVID hit, I had offered, I don't have to, but I had offered to teach a PGCE class at Stellenbosch University. And when they went into online teaching, I said, I'm sorry, get somebody else to teach it, because I cannot teach a screen. And all I see, like now, are the names of people, right? And because I know some of you, that helps a lot. But for me, teaching or even running a workshop, I depend entirely on cues. I wasn't as aware of it until the lockdown, that I would look at Duduzile's face and see she's troubled about something I said. I would look at Pranita's face and I would see, there's some body language when I talked about race or something like that. I would look at Christine's face or Fazila's face, and something would tell me in the body language that I must either teach faster or slower, that I need to stop for a question, that I need to divert to a joke, that I need to do something just to bring everybody on board. And as I look over the class of 280 young people, I am able to make those judgments, those professional judgments in real time. This is something I've obviously been taught and that I taught myself, and that is the skill of emotional leadership. The one thing that I very briefly want to sort of expand on is political leadership. And I don't mean politics with a big P. I mean political in the sense of the root meaning of the word, which is the ability to influence others for the good, hopefully. And very few of our leaders outside of politics, big politics, have a sense of political leadership. What do I mean, colleagues, by political leadership? Let me mention a few things. In the past few weeks, I don't know of a single week that has passed when a school wasn't in trouble for race issues, okay? Last week or the week before, it was a school in Gauteng, I think Gamble, you know, one of those schools. Today, I listened on the radio as I was driving, there was another school in trouble, and the students were demanding. Now, I'm not, you know, taking a position on who's right and who's wrong. I'm simply saying one of the reasons we don't have political leadership, these troubles, is we don't have strong political leadership. And what do I mean by this, obviously? And let me just mention two things. One is to be able to create within your school community and your business and your university what I call a discourse community, a way of speaking about yourself and others, so that every speech that you make, I hardly ever made a speech in which, as a university vice chancellor, with especially at graduations, opening up the academic year, etc., when I did not mention that this university is committed, deeply committed, to create a space in which everybody here feels welcome, regardless of what they look like, regardless of how they love, regardless of where they were born, regardless of how much their parents earn. And I would say that every single day almost. Why? Because I am creating a discourse community in which you remind the people that you work with, the children sitting in the assembly, this is what the school is about. And if you don't like it, then there's no place for you here. You can say that at university, of course. But that sense of what the school is about, when I look at schools in the southern suburbs and I look at schools in the northern suburbs that are 95% white in 2021 in the learner enrollments and almost 100% white in the teaching complement, I don't think, first of all, they have any sense of what this country is about. But I also don't think they have any political instincts. Now, politics here is the ability to influence your governing body, the ability to influence your parents so that they know that their own children benefit when the school is more diverse, both in its staff and in its student body. Creating a discourse community is fundamental, just the way in which you speak, that gives people on a daily basis a sense of what you stand for. Zelensky has a presence in which the politics he is talking about is not just grand politics for his party or his country. It is the politics of the people. It is persuading people, I am with you, I am present among you, and we will stand together. Let me give you another example from education of political leadership. That is the need to be conscious all the time about inclusion, okay? Are the girl students included in everything? Are students with disabilities included in everything? Are students from other African countries included in everything? That is as true when you're teaching grade 8 science as it is true when you are leading from the principal's office. You have to communicate a sense, both in your leadership example, as well as in your words, that this is, and let me just say this about citizenship. I was pressing my colleagues yesterday when they were briefing me about today, and I said to them, I feel very uncomfortable with the notion of citizenship and of citizen, because it is so often used in our country to exclude rather than to include. So when I think of citizen, I think of an ID card. When I think of citizen, I think of where you were born. That is not for me what a citizen is about. A citizen for me, first of all, is somebody whose commitment to humanity is borderless. Let me repeat that. A global citizen for me is somebody whose commitment to humanity is borderless. Those of you who read my Times column last week would remember that I wrote about a meeting I had at Grove Primary at 5:30 in the morning with a team led by Mthetheleli Solomons from Gift of the Givers. And you know, I was so struck by his humility in leadership. I was so struck by his vision in leadership. And he is telling me about himself and how they served in Somalia and Guinea and so on and so forth. And today they're going to Towser River, this is last Saturday, and they were going to take a multidisciplinary team of medical professionals, nurses, doctors, orthopedic, gynecologists, ENT specialists. They all went off to give free services because it doesn't exist in Towser River at that level. And as he concludes his introduction of himself, because we up to that point we'd only spoken on the phone, he says to me, oh, by the way, I was born in Pakistan. I thought to myself, here is South Africa's most admired, leader in civil society. I wonder how many of us, with those sort of particularly these days with these anti-immigrant sentiments, realize that, yeah, man, born in Pakistan, you know, his parents bring him to this country and he becomes such an incredibly powerful example of how to be a decent leader in the midst of a very corrupt, our time to eat kind of leadership and so on. Political leadership is what Imtiaz does. He uses his influence to show up, you know, others without making a scene of it. He said that a politician, when he was going to, on his way to tell the politician that's going to Taza River, and the politician said, oh, we're so glad that you're going to Taza River because government cannot do everything. To which he responded, government does bugger all, you know. That is true. And so you don't wait for government to wake up, you do it yourself. Conscious of the need for inclusion. And I just want to say this, as I will say in every speech I make for the next, as long as I can breathe. There is something very dangerous going on in South Africa at the moment. I used to think it was just among people in the townships who were envious of the Somali shop trader who seemed to be doing much better next door. Now, this language of xenophobia, I call it polite xenophobia, is in the public sector itself. It is within government departments. You know, we were told the other day by a minister, fortunately I wasn't at that meeting as the president of the Academy of Science. Fortunately, I wasn't at that meeting because it would have been chaos. To be careful and not to appoint you know, people from other African countries. What the hell is that? That's not leadership. That is the worst kind of display of human frailty, you know, when you scapegoat, because you can't create jobs for what you regard as your own people, you now scapegoat other people who are making a contribution to this country, you know. And I can tell you now, in my universities, the universities I've worked in my corner of the vineyard, a lot of our universities would be absolutely nothing if it wasn't for top scholars from other African countries. University of Fort Hare would have to close down. I just did workshops for their senior academics. They would have to close down because most of those brothers and sisters are from other African countries. The people who are the most highly rated in publishing academic work are people like, you know, Pilus, the professor of agriculture here at Stellenbosch University. I can give you 20 people like that. At UCT, another 20. These are people that enrich our cultures, that teach our students, that create the next generation of South Africans, black and white, to become professors. Stella Nkomo at UP, Akilim Bembe at WITS, Ambroise Wonkam, who's sadly the world's leading population geneticist, who sadly just left UCT to go and head up medical genetics at one of the world's leading medical universities, Johns Hopkins in Baltimore, Maryland. We need people from other countries because they enrich our lives, they enrich our cultures, they teach our students. You go to Soweto today and you will see all the subjects are low-performing subjects except in science and math. 9 out of 10, those are teachers from Zimbabwe, teachers from other SADC countries. And now we are refusing in some provinces to have them teach our students because of this lustful, xenophobic attacks on our brothers and sisters. Political leadership in a school means being inclusive. I spoke at Fairbairn College on Monday morning, and it's so wonderful to see this trend. And I say this as somebody who comes from a conservative evangelical background. And as I came in, there was a Hindu person who was doing a prayer, and then a student, and then a Muslim student, and then a Christian student. That is the way you build inclusion. Instead of pretending that your assembly is a bloody church, you know, in a public school of all places, you know. Political leadership for me is leadership that builds an inclusive sense of people by race, gender, national origins, and belief system, and what have you. So the first thing we see with Zelensky is this very powerful sense of present leadership. But the second thing you see with him is selfless leadership. So first Koelsum and then Vader. Just make sure you're all muted. Thanks. I actually like the gossip in the background, but anyway, what does selfless leadership mean in the case? Let me use Zelensky. So in preparing for today and for my article on Thursday, I went and did some research on Zelensky.
Why?
So
If I get free things, then I'm a patient. I see it.
Koelsum, can you please help us by muting yourself? Thank you.
Selfless leadership. And so in August 29, this is what Zelensky says. I really, to his people, I really don't want my pictures on your walls for the president. For the president is not an icon, an idol, or a portrait. Hang your kids' photos instead. And look at them each time you are making a decision. Wow. Next time you walk into a South African government department, or as I often do in some rural schools, and you see those huge overbearing photos of the president and the premier. In KwaZulu-Natal, in some rural schools, you still see the former president's picture as well. Any number of local wannabes, MECs, all of these people. When you see these big photos, understand that they are not Zelensky. Understand that they think it's about them. Understand that that is not selfless leadership. If you need a humongous photo on the wall of your school or your business to impress your authority on those whom you serve, then I want to tell you, you are not a selfless leader. And then thirdly, what I learned from Zelensky and what I admire about Zelensky is the example he offers us of sacrificial leadership. Now, I'm going to say something here that will probably shock some of you, but others of you have heard me say this before. You're only a good leader to the extent that you are poorer by the time you leave your position of leadership. When everything you have, materially, emotionally, spiritually, you give in order to serve others. Sacrificial leadership means that you put yourself in harm's way on behalf of the people whom you are privileged to serve. This flies in the face of egotistical leadership. This flies in the face of Tarzan models of leadership. This flies in the face of the sort of big man leadership, theories that you see in the corporate world. Leadership is only impactful, powerful, felt when you are not only poorer as a result of your leadership, but that you put yourself in harm's way. That is something I learned from Zelensky. Some of you might have seen a beautiful photograph of this man and his family. He himself has tragedy in his background. He is the only Jewish president, I'm told, or head of state outside of Israel. And there's this picture of Zelensky, his wife, and their two beautiful daughters. And as I looked at this picture, I realized that this man and his family would probably go down together for the sake of their country. Lesser politicians would, at the very least, have airlifted their families to safety and hid themselves in a bunker somewhere. He surely must know the murderous plans of Putin to take out the head of state and impose another pro-Russian puppet president. Zelensky and his wife must surely have pondered that outcome and yet decided to stay put. There is a principle at stake here. I call it, as you now know, sacrificial leadership. What a contrast with our own country. We have exactly the opposite here. This is our time to eat leadership, as I said earlier, where every movement of state monies is fair game among the political vultures along the distribution chain. Missing from Finance Minister Enoch Godongwane's budget speech was a column of provisions for corruption. At least that would have been an honest budget. Putting your life on the line for the people you serve is the last thing on the minds of our venal leaders. They should hang their heads in shame when watching the Ukrainian leader. Instead, what do our leaders do? I just discovered on Twitter. They went to break bread with the Russians at their consulate in Cape Town this week to celebrate 30 years of ties with South Africa. And they do this in the middle of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. That is not leadership. That makes a mockery of leadership, makes a mockery of the legacy of Nelson Mandela and everything we owe to leaders of that caliber. And so I challenge you today, my dear friends and colleagues, is your leadership in your school something you would describe as a present leadership, a selfless leadership, and a sacrificial leadership? Because if it is, you don't even have to use the word transformation to describe what you do. Thank you very much.